Today I'm going to talk about naming characters, which is ironic because I'm really bad at it. It can be really hard to come up with a name that perfectly fits a character, but I have picked up some tips and advice that I'd like to pass along. So without any delay, here they are. Tip number one, name the characters according to the setting and genre of story. This could go without saying, but names from a fantasy novel sound a lot different than those from a contemporary American novel. And American names are different from Middle Eastern names, Spanish names, French names. You get the idea. Tip number two, for real first names, use a baby naming website like babynames.com or a name meaning site like behindthename.com. Aside from giving you name ideas, these sites also provide information like the meanings of the names and when they were most popular. Knowing how popular a name was from year to year can be especially helpful for writers of historical fiction. Tip number three, for real last names, try surnames.behindthename.com or browse through the white pages of a phone book. Tip number four, for fantasy or unique names, try fantasynamegenerators.com. Tip number five, avoid using names that are very similar or share the same first letter. I wouldn't say you should never do this, but take into consideration that having two very similar names might confuse the reader. For example, if you have two women named Tasha and Tanya, both of those names start with the same letter and have the same number of letters, so there's a pretty high likelihood that the reader might get them mixed up. It's a lot better to choose names that start with different letters and have a different number of syllables, just sound different in general. Tip number six, when you have a name in mind, do a search for it to make sure it hasn't been used before or doesn't already belong to someone well known. Tip number seven, be consistent with the name you choose. Sometimes names can be shortened or have a variant, like Daniel to Dan or Robert to Bobby. It's fine to include these variations in a story. Maybe Robert's mother calls him Bobby most of the time and only calls him Robert when she's really upset. Meanwhile, his friends call him Rob. But decide on these rules ahead of time and stick to them. Definitely try to avoid using different names in the narration because that can be distracting or even confusing. As readers, we can easily figure out that Rob and Bobby are the same person based on who's talking, but there's rarely a good reason why the narrator would have to switch between names, so use one assigned name for each character when you're writing the narrative. Otherwise, you could have one sentence read, Robert put on his coat, and another one reads, Rob started his car, and it's just unnecessary to be calling them two different names. Tip number eight, choose names that are easy to pronounce. Even though most reading isn't done out loud, people still like to know what a character's name sounds like. Names that are difficult to read are distracting at best and irritating at worst. You don't want someone to put your book down because they literally can't read some of it. Tip number nine, take the meanings of names into consideration, but don't overdo it. Matching every character's name to their personality or defining trait isn't necessary and can actually be spoilery in some cases. For example, if you're using an English to Swahili dictionary to name your African lion characters, I'm looking at you, Lion King fandom, and you give the name Usalidi to a character who starts out seeming good but ends up being a villain and a plot twist near the end, anyone who knew or looked up the meaning of the name Usalidi isn't going to be surprised. It means betrayal. And tip number 10, try a name out while you're writing the first draft, and if it doesn't work, swap it for a different one. Don't be afraid to rename characters over and over, even during the writing process, until you find the right one. Some names just fit better than others, and it's worth it to find out what name fits your character best. Well, that's all for this episode. If you'd like to help me out, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Another way you can help is to check out my Etsy store for fun and unique items. Just follow the link in the description below. And if you're a Christian artist, writer, or other creative type of person, please consider joining my Facebook community called All Christian Artists and Writers. Shalom!